Welcome to our webinar today, everybody. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional summer hunting grounds of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people and pay my respect to their elders past, present and future. We're really happy today to have Mark Finney presenting. But before we do that, I'd just like to go over a bit of the housekeeping. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, you've got a Q&A function and a chat function. If you could use the chat function to tell Mark how great you thought his webinar was, that would be really great. And use the Q&A function to actually ask questions of Mark, which we will work through at the end of the webinar. I'd like to now just hand over to Andrew Sturgis from Red Eye. Andrew's probably well known to a lot of you from his time at QFES, and he's been instrumental in connecting us with Mark for this webinar today. He'll introduce Mark more officially, but has a few words to say before that. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Ted. Good morning, everybody. Andrew Sturgis, formerly of Queensland Fire and Emergency Services. G'day to everybody, and like Deb, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the land on which we meet. For me, that's the Turrbal and Yagara people. And yeah, paying my respect to their elders, but also in line with the theme of these two webinars, of which this is the first one with Mark, is that the traditional owners of our lands managed fire for not decades and not hundreds of years, but for thousands of years. And the managing the fire, I think the language is important. It's something that I want to talk about over these couple of webinars. Move away from being firefighters and combat agencies and suppressing fire. Yep, I get there's a place for suppression, but looking through Mark's long history of research and achievements, and one of the things that stood out to me and resonated with me was that we must explain fire behaviour, not just model it, if we are to realise better opportunities in managing and living with wildland fire. So it's about seeking a harmony with the environment, and that's what traditional owners did so very well have done over such a very long time. Also acknowledge that the climate has changed. According to my weather zone app, Darwin set a record for a July temperature yesterday. Their records go back to 1941, broke it by a couple of degrees, which is a really significant breaking of a record, but pales in insignificance as to what's happened over the summer again in Northern America and about 1,000 k's west of northwest of where Mark is in Missoula. Set a record of 49.6 degrees Celsius or 121 degrees Fahrenheit. The previous record was 45 degrees. So we're not breaking temperature records. We're not breaking records in this climate change by small amounts. We're smashing them out of the park. We think the way that we're to do this is to manage fire, work with fire, and to focus on prevention and preparedness, acknowledging that there's a place for suppression and absolutely recovery costs. We want to shift the focus, and that's our aim at Red Eye. We'll talk about that much more in our second webinar, which we hope you can join us for on the 12th of October. So really pleased to have Mark presenting today. And I noticed, Mark, looking back through your history, that you're an ecologist at Kings Canyon, where the current fires are burning down the south of Sierra Nevadas, and the General Sherman tree, the largest tree in the world, was on the news in Australia over this past weekend, where they were taking defensive actions that normally applied to the built environment and to structures, wrapping it up in alfoil. Be keen to hear your thoughts on the fire season there, and then into the today's webinar. Over to you. Thanks very much, Mark. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me to present today, and to AFAC for hosting this webinar. It's a pleasure to be with you. So my talk today is primarily concerned with values and how to protect them from wildfire. And a lot of the examples I'm going to give today come from the Western United States, where I've spent a career working, They may or they may not apply to Australian conditions. For example, the background on this slide is one of those giant sequoia forests that Andrew just mentioned. This one, in the big tree in the foreground with that guy standing there, is probably 500 to 800 years old, and one of about 10% of all known giant sequoias that were killed last year in one single fire. So unlike eucalyptus, our conifer forests don't regenerate vegetatively. They don't sprout back. These trees are dead, so they'll have to regenerate from seed. Now, we see a lot of news about fire in these days in Australia, in the United States, in Europe, pretty much on every vegetated continent. Right now, the thing in the news here in the United States are the giant sequoia trees. And as Andrew mentioned, I worked there 30 years ago and did quite a bit of prescribed burning in and around these groves. But that was always a challenge because of the smoke issues, because of public perception of changes in the forest, things like this. It was always a challenge, and the park attempts to balance all of the different perspectives on managing things, and can't always do what's scientifically known, and increasing the rate and pace and scale of burning. Let's see, my mouse was the only thing that works here. So we also see a lot of fires in the news, extensive fires. This was from 2020 in the west coast of the United States, California, Oregon, Washington. 1.6 million hectares were on fire that season. It followed on the heels of your extraordinary season in 2019-2020 in Australia, where about 6 million hectares burned. So even though this was severe for us, it was a lot less severe than what you experienced. But we're also seeing fires that are far more destructive to communities and to human lives. This was the Camp Fire in 2018 that burned an entire town and killed 84 people. And the San Jose Mercury News here is noticing the eerie similarity to a fire that occurred 1 century before. And what they're talking about here are a series of fires that occurred during the settlement era in the Western United States in the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s into the early 1900s. Cloquet Fire in Minnesota in the upper left burned 100,000 hectares and killed 453 people. These were large fires. They killed a lot of people. The tallies aren't very good because it was hard in those days to get a census of how many people actually died and how big the fires were. But the Hinckley Fire, 81,000 hectares, 418 people dead. The Peshtigo Fire, 500,000 hectares, 2,500 fatalities. And up in Canada, Saskatchewan and Alberta, 2 million hectares and 87 fatalities. These were big fires caused by the settlement of the West, indiscriminate logging and burning, careless activities out in the wildlands. But the big fire that changed the way the U.S. Managed its lands in terms of fire were the 1910 fires on the Idaho and Montana border, very near where I'm speaking to you today. In fact, the lab that I work at wouldn't be here in Missoula, Montana, had it not been for these fires. That's what stimulated an awful lot of interest in fire research back in the early 20th century. Well, these fires burned 800,000 acres, killed 86 people, and transformed U.S. Wildfire policy to one of total suppression, pretty much total suppression until about the 1970s. Now, throughout this entire century after the 1910 fires, wildland fire had remained kind of a land management concern. Most people didn't give it too much of a thought. There were fires out there, some were in the news, but then in recent decades, mostly the last decade, because of the increased burning rates, the increased sizes of fire, it's gaining a broad amount of attention, and rarely a week goes by where I don't get one or more inquiries from many different new disciplines: engineering, architecture, reinsurance, technology companies, entrepreneurs, academics, defense industries, charities and trusts, attorneys. All of them are asking questions and trying to be relevant to solving some of the problems today. Mostly they start off talking with me about proposing ideas to improve suppression or protection of assets. That's what they think of most. Now, when I start talking with them, I usually ask, what do they think are the wildfire problems? And inevitably it's, well, fires are damaging communities, and they're immune to control. They're damaging ecosystems and natural resources and producing smoke that chokes our population. The causes, of course, are the three big ones: climate change, naive development in wildlands, meaning people are moving there without any idea of bushfires or wildland fire and their responsibility in it, and fuel accumulation because of this paradigm of fire suppression or attempt to exclude it. And their intuition here, like most of the public, is that fire itself is the problem, right? Just like a fire in your house or in a building. The fire is destructive. It's, of course, not necessary in your house, and so get rid of it. That's our reaction. But really, if you're going to solve a problem, what you have to do is understand the system that creates it. Is the wildland fire problem that we're dealing with, is it the fire itself, or is it what the wildfire is doing to people and to places and to things we care about? Or is it what people are doing to the wildfires and the places and the things that we care about? So until we understand this system, we're not going to be able to get to the bottom of the problem. While the recent wildfires that we're seeing all over the world are telling us right now something very clear, and that is that current practices are not protecting our wildlands, and they're not protecting our communities. And so if that was true, if they were protecting these assets or these values, we wouldn't be having them in the news. So the question is really, what are we doing? What are our current practices achieving? Well, where they're achieving more suppression, or attempting, right? We know, however, given infinite amounts of funds and effort and equipment and technology, that we're not going to be able to improve suppression effectiveness. 2% of the fires in the United States have become large ever since record keeping began in the early 1900s. And we've just seen an escalation in sizes and burning amounts and in the severity of these fires. And in the end, what we have to do is do things differently. We have to think about the problem differently. We can't just do the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Unfortunately, that's what our proclivities are. Let's just do more of the same and somehow it will all work out in the end. Well, it isn't happening. So the outline for my talk today is very briefly going to cover changes in wildland fire that have occurred in the last century or so, objectives for fire management, effectiveness of landscape mitigation, and finally, the culture and incentives that we experience here in wildland fire management. So the modern fire regime, this is pretty much the way it is all over the world. We extinguish all the fires that we can, those that are occurring under mild and moderate conditions in all vegetation zones, that it pretty much gets rid of 98%. We save the fuel. By getting rid of the mild fires, we save all the fuel for the worst case when we can't do anything about it. So most of the area is burned, say 95% more or less, under these 2% conditions. And those conditions, of course, are dry and windy, long range spotting, pretty much impervious to control. Suppression forces are overwhelmed. We get large patches of very high severity for the vegetation, for the watersheds, for the animals, for the habitat, pretty much any of the wildland values that we have, and we have these fires impinging on developed areas. This is a completely different fire regime in the Western United States than occurred prior to the early 20th century or the late 19th century. So the way we can visualize this in one slide is this ratio of modern to historical burning. Basically, we take the modern burning rates and we divide those by the historical burning rates, or our estimates of them. These historical burning rates were due to a combination of lightning or natural ignitions as well as indigenous burning. And what you can see here in the cool colors, the greens and the blues, that's where we're burning a lot less, 3 to 10 times less than historically we estimate fires were occurring. All the places in the warm colors, the yellows and the reds, those are places we're burning more. And I'll explain why we're burning more than historically occurred, and it's by about the same ratio. It's about, on average, about 5 times more in those yellow and red areas than historically, and about 5 times less in the cool colors. So let's just talk really briefly about the indigenous fire activity and fire uses. These are 2 great books. You're probably familiar with the one on the right called The Biggest Estate on Earth, How Aborigines Made Australia. This is by Bill Gamage. And the one on the left is called Forgotten Fires. Native Americans in Transient Wilderness, and by Omer Stewart. And both of these books have a lot in common. They talk about how fire was used deliberately by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. The entire continents were basically managed. There was no wilderness, so to speak, in the European mind as we have it today. And the vegetation was essentially in a managed condition at the time of European contact. So that's very different than the way most people, at least in the Western United States, think about the vast areas of the West. They think about it as being a wilderness until they encountered it. Couldn't be anything farther from the truth. Many of the low elevation and middle elevation forests, such as giant sequoia, but this is ponderosa pine, were maintained and sustained by fairly frequent fire, low intensity fire, just like this, that cleaned up the place, removed litter and duff and all of the down woody material, kept fuel loadings low, very low emissions, even though lots of area was burned. And we can see this from fire history evidence all over the country. So I'm just going to talk about one tiny little source from Arizona and New Mexico. This is a summary of studies. All those red dots on the map are locations of intensive fire history studies where many, many fire-scarred sections were collected. Fire-scarred sections like the one you see right up above it there, where you can see the tree rings. And the tree rings there, you can date the fire occurrence, and you can see all the dates, 1809, 1812. Every few years there was a fire on that one section. Now, if you take each one of those dots and you look over on the right-hand side, every one of those horizontal lines represents one of those studies, and all the little yellow tick marks on that timeline indicate fire years. The red lines indicate regional years where there's synchronous activity across the large area. Now, the main take-home message is look how frequently and how many of those yellow and red tick marks there are prior to about 1900. There were lots. Fires were occurring every 2 or 3 or 4 years, and right up to 1900, and then they ceased. And then there's almost no fire activity after that. That's the changes that we're witnessing now, the consequence of those changes in the fuel structure and in the vegetation. So the giant sequoia, to come back to that example, stands that were composed of these very large trees on the left that were very open and very little understory because the fires were occurring every 3 or 4 or 5 years. Compare that to 1890 to 1970, and it's even worse now. Okay, so a lot of restoration work and a lot of maintenance burning has to be done in the forest to compensate for the absence of fire. Similar photographs, repeat photographs can be found all over the Western United States showing very open forests and very low fuel accumulations. This is also in the Sierra Nevada of California, comparing with 1915 there to 2005. Look at the changes in forest structure, very productive sites. And so no wonder we're having the kind of crown fires that we have now. In the Great Basin, the interior desert areas where I said fire was burning too much, it's because we have invasive grasses. So a lot of this cheatgrass, this is an annual grass, very fine material, dies every year. It fills in all of these gaps between these shrubs. So normally on the left, you would have gaps of dirt or barren areas in between the sagebrush or pinyon juniper trees, but now that's filled in with a lot of fine grass. And so it can burn every year. So that's the reason it is burning more frequently than historically occurred. So let's talk about objectives for fire management. So what are our fire management objectives? It's an open question. In the United States, whether at the state, or the local level, or the federal level, we've generally failed to establish management objectives for fire. And without explicit achievable objectives, we can't have a strategy, right? How do you design a strategy to achieve something that you haven't specified? Firefighting is not a strategy, it's a reaction. It's entirely tactical, right? It's total defense. And yet we have no offense. At any contest that we have, whether it's a ball game or with wildland fire, we can't win unless we have an offense. And we haven't specified an objective. So let's assume the protection of various values is our fire objective. And I think that's fair to say many people would agree that we're trying to protect these various resources, right? There are other objectives, and we're not going to get into all of those, but there are other objectives for our activities, some of which are quite self-serving. But if we're going to protect things, we can divide it up into kind of three main categories: wildlands, communities, and people. And the wildlands, we'll talk more about this, includes watersheds, habitat, fauna, timber, all of these kinds of various values. So if we want to protect these things, that really means reducing risk, because we can't eliminate fire from the system. We've tried that for a century. We failed to do it. We can't eliminate it. All we can really do is to choose when we have fire and what kind of fire to have. And so this means that we need to use our risk mitigation metrics or techniques to reduce probabilities of fire impacts on various values, the probability of fire impacting them, and reduce also the susceptibility of those values once a fire does impact them. So let's talk about these values. What and the attributes of protection. What am I talking about? So I'm going to talk about the wildlands. Our values are for watershed, timber, habitat, recreation, right? There's many different wildland values. Communities would include buildings, homes, infrastructure, power lines, that kind of thing. And of course, people, our lives and our health are very important. Also, mental trauma when we have extreme events or disasters. Are these insurable? Well, the wildland values are not insurable. I don't know of any insurance companies that have taken up this issue, but it's pretty impossible to replace 1,000-year-old trees with insurance. So once they're gone, they're pretty much gone. Communities, well, in general, there is insurance available for various aspects of communities. Lives, this is in health and trauma with people. Well, it's in some ways, you say, well, there's life insurance. Well, that's not really what I'm talking about. Lives are irreplaceable. Health, of course, insurance and healthcare can help remediate injuries and that kind of thing, or mental trauma. But really, it's difficult to insure people's health and well-being. Replacement time. Well, on the wildlands, we're talking in the United States here, decades for some watershed values or vegetation cover, to centuries or even never. It's just not recoverable or not replaceable if they're killed. The giant sequoias are one of those things. Some of these are 3,000 years old, and many of the other forests, of course, that are younger and not such iconoclastic or iconic species, they may come back, but not for generations. So communities, well, you're talking about months to years, so a much faster replacement time for these things. They can be rebuilt. People, of course, are irreplaceable. Mitigation. How is mitigation accomplished? Well, for wildlands, it's prescribed burning or other land management activities, but primarily prescribed fire, because these are fire-dependent ecosystems. Communities, we can engineer buildings and structures and infrastructure to be resistant to ignition and to damage. We can harden these structures, and we can maintain them in conditions to where they're defensible. People, of course, the primary mitigation measure is education. We can talk about evacuation and other kinds of technologies to communicate with people during emergencies, but primarily it's education to help them understand the kind of risks that are out there. The scale of mitigation. Well, on landscapes, you're talking about tens of thousands of hectares, maybe hundreds of thousands of hectares. And contrast that, of course, with local scale for community protection. Research has certainly shown that protecting assets is primarily at a local scale. So homes can be protected within a few tens of meters of the home, for example. And people, education and evacuation, this is a local phenomenon. It can be coordinated and messaged at a national level, but primarily it occurs at a local level. The frequency of mitigation. How often do we have to mitigate these things? Well, in wildlands, somewhere on these very large landscapes will be burning every single year. On the other hand, you can say at any given spot, maybe it's decadal or every few years that we'll have to be engaging in maintenance or mitigation. Communities, it'll be annual. People are responsible for taking care of their properties or maintaining their assets in an ignition resistant condition. The same way with people. We have to continually message mitigation and safety and fire issues in order to have people maintain awareness. Who's responsible for these kinds of things? Well, in the wildlands, it's kind of a collective responsibility, and that's one of our problems. Is it's kind of everybody's responsibility, but at the same time, it's no one's responsibility. We have a mixture of public lands and we have a mixture of private lands. So it isn't any one single entity that's responsible for all of these different wildlands. Coordinating that and accomplishing mitigation goals on such broad landscapes with complex ownership is extremely difficult. And Australia and the US have suffered from these challenges, trying to accomplish this at broad enough scale to be meaningful. Our communities, it's primarily a personal responsibility, a local private property issue. And so as much as the Forest Service, the agency that I work for, is interested in helping communities prepare for wildfire, is primarily an issue that is addressable only by the communities themselves. It can be organized by communities and messaged at a community scale, but ultimately it's up to private landowners to take care of their property. So these are some of the attributes, the contrasting attributes of different values for protection. I want to focus on the wildlands here a little bit because that's mainly where my job is, and mainly my concern is over our wildland values that are difficult to replace. They may be irreplaceable for generations. And it involves collective responsibility, figuring out how to maintain these in a fire safe condition and sustain them through the changing climate and with fire rather than having them destroyed. So let's talk about fire as an effective landscape mitigation tool briefly. Fire has an irreplaceable role in our wildlands for mitigation or for maintenance of ecological processes. Whether this is a prescribed fire or whether it's a wildfire, fire is irreplaceable. Why? It can't be replaced by mechanical activities such as harvesting or other kinds of thinning, that kind of thing, because fire removes surface fuels that wildfires depend on. It's non-merchantable. The vast wildlands, 500,000 acres here, 500,000 hectares here and there, you're not going to mechanically visit every single square meter. That we remove litter and duff with prescribed burning. This is a majority of the loading in our forests is needle litter and duff. Long burning generates very deep flame zones. That's part of the problem for these large fires is the burning duration is very long because we have such high fuel loads. Fire removes rotten wood that's receptive for embers, for long range spotting, for long duration smoke production. Fire removes and kills small trees and unmerchantable material otherwise couldn't be removed. Scorches and kills the limbs of large trees, elevating their crown above the ground, keeping it distant from heat from surface fires. Top kill sprouting brush species, so maintaining those in a low condition. The end result of having fire in the forest is maintaining very thin flame zones in these wildfires. That's what keeps the severity low, keeps the fire spreading slow, and keeps it controllable, is having very, very thin flame zones, even under extreme conditions. We have plenty of proof of that, and I'm going to show you some of it. So I just picked out an example. We see these examples across our landscapes pretty much in every Western state where we've had previous wildfires within the last decade or two. We're seeing modified movement of these large fires. This happens to be the Dixie Fire. This is the largest single fire in California history. It's burning as we speak, although not very actively. It's about 400,000 hectares. The only place it's moderated in its growth, it's got a very strange pattern here, is it's bumped into lakes and other barriers, meadows. But you see those big red arrows, those are places where there are fairly recent fires and the fire has moved around them. So clearly that presence of that previous fire, the removal of the fuel by those fires has changed the behavior of this, changed its movement. Across this entire landscape, something that you can't tell from this, there have been many, many places where there's been commercial harvesting and thinning activities. None of those places made any difference to the movement of the fire. It's only where we've had fire and its effects on the fuel structure that's changed the movement of this fire. So we see this all over the place. That's just one ongoing example. Here's another single example, one of many, of prescribed fire effects. This is a very large fire. This is from 2002. This is a Landsat 7 image of two fires burning. They eventually merged together, as I'll show you. And what's remarkable about this picture is the holes in the funny shapes of these fires. If you're used to looking at fire patterns, what you notice is, for example, I'll just indicate for this larger fire, there's a giant hole in the middle of it. And there are these strange kind of bends in the shape of the fire. That's not normal for fires. They don't look like that. Now, the one on the left, this fire is very flat at the head. That's normally not how fires occur. So we investigated what was the cause of these strange patterns in this Landsat image of the fire actively spreading. And what we found is that all of the places where we're seeing strange changes in the fire are because these are recently burned areas from prescribed burning. This happens to be on one of our Indian reservations, on the White Mountain Apache Reservation, and in Arizona. And they had done extensive prescribed burning operations there. Each one of these polygons is about 4,000 or 5,000 acres. So what is that, about 2,000 hectares? So pretty big areas. And when I asked them, how did you burn those large areas? Was this primarily by helicopter? They say, no, we burned with matches. And what they meant was they just walked through the woods with boxes of strike anywhere matches, and they just lit whatever could be lit. And all of the fires coalesced and eventually burned these areas. And what you can see, it was very, very effective. This is the post-fire severity image. And all of the places that are still green there correspond to the prescribed burn units. Okay, I'll just flip back and forth, and you can see that live trees exist in the areas that had been previously burned within 10 years before this fire, and everywhere else has very, very high severity. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that a majority of this fire burned in what was called commercial forest. Almost all of it had been subjected to harvesting and thinning for nearly a century. So none of this area was wild or terribly overgrown. It was just hadn't been recently managed with fire. So I'll just emphasize the point. Fire is irreplaceable in our ecosystems anyway. And without it, we really don't have an effective fuel treatment. This is just an example right on the edge of one of these prescribed burn units. On the left is the area that had been burned a few years before, and on the right, of course, is the wildfire, showing its high severity. Pretty much killed all of the trees there. So lastly, I'll conclude with something I'll call culture and incentives. So if we know all of this information from science, right? We have a century of fire science, fire behavior, fire effects, prescribed burning, fire ecology. If we have all of this knowledge, why don't we use it in our management? So the way I look at it is we have a wildland fire culture with built-in incentives and disincentives. And this culture is composed of 4 interacting parts. They all interact with each other. None of them are independent. And that's what makes it so resistant to any kind of change. That the culture consists of a public compartment where expectations concerning wildfire are put forth, their understanding, their partnership perhaps with agencies, the media, how wildfire is portrayed in various media, the television, et cetera, and how we expect it to be portrayed, right? Elected officials, they're the ones who appropriate funding, they're the ones who create legislation, et cetera, and they respond to the public, and they respond to the media, and they respond to the agencies. And so the last compartment here in culture is the agencies themselves. And this is any and all agencies, not just the Forest Service, but basically the agencies have a lot of expertise in fire, in firefighting and fire management. We have a lot of information. We're the ones who perform an awful lot of the action and do communication. Now this culture is a suppression culture at the moment. We've built this culture for a century or so. It's an emergency response culture. When fires occur, we know exactly what to do, and we fall into that mode of operations. We do it. And when the fires are over, we congratulate ourselves and we go away. But the fuels stay on the ground in the places that haven't yet burned until the next fire. So the incentives, let's just look at some incentives. This is a very busy slide. I'm just going to read off a number of these to illustrate what I'm talking about. But the public is incentivized and disincentivized in different ways. They're afraid of fire, right? And so they expect a strong emergency response to fires. There's liability for the public if they attempt to employ fire on their own lands, liability for damages to adjacent lands. They object to smoke. That's an offsite impact that has a huge amount of effect on agencies' ability, anyone's ability to conduct prescribed burning. The perception of risk. Fires are relatively rare, even though they're common nationwide, they're relatively rare at any given place. So it's easy for members of the public to say, we haven't seen a fire here, in my time. So we don't perceive the risk very much. So we're not going to take action. Not incentivized to do that. The media, of course, love wildfire emergencies. And they'd rather cover that than beneficial uses of fire, which can be controversial. They love controversy too, but they rarely cover the beneficial uses of fire versus the damaging ones. And so the public gets a very filtered view of what fires are like, right? There's very little investigative journalism to elucidate an awful lot of these complex dimensions of wildland fire. Our elected officials, they fund primarily suppression. In the United States, it's 90% at the federal level is of all the federal funds spent are on suppression. When you add in state and local funds, it's well north of 95% versus proactive management. Evacuations, government primarily responsible for evacuating people. I know the Australians have led the way in looking at stay early and or leave early and stay and defend. That's an important thing that's really not made it into U.S. discussions at all, but I think it's super important. We're not seeing any leadership from at any level on building codes or maintenance standards for various private properties. Accountability for ignitions. Anybody who starts a fire is prosecuted, right? But we don't hold people account for creating landscape conditions that are basically hazardous, not only to our wildland values but to our communities. So this is an imbalance. Lobbying, certainly there's a lot of lobbying by the suppression industry. A lot of people are making money off of that, and that influences elected officials. Our agencies are incentivized, a lot of people incentivized by overtime pay for suppression. There isn't overtime for regular work on the land. And so that disincentivizes that compared to simply reacting. Land management and fire management are separate functions within our agency. Our policy says that they shouldn't be, but in reality, fire management operates in its own kind of sphere, separate from the land management objectives and the long-term vision for the land. Regulations, land management itself, so conducting prescribed fire or any kind of activity is subject to environmental regulation, whereas fire response is not. So there's a disincentive to actually doing the hard work and getting through all that regulatory, those regulatory hurdles in order to get work done. And there's been an absence of public information on the major issues facing us in wildfire, right? We have Smokey Bear, which you may be familiar with, very effective at messaging, avoiding the use of careless fire, right? Careless fire, but not terribly effective at conveying the necessary use of fire or the necessary presence of fire to maintain our land. So that's a long list on this slide here, but I think it's important to realize the incentives and disincentives in the system. So let me just show you an example of how our elected officials act sometimes. This is last year, or this year. It's actually earlier in spring, in March, I believe. This is a headline in the Denver Post. Colorado also had a big year in 2020. Bracing for more big wildfires, Colorado leaders shift strategy to fight fires when they're small. Boy, I'm glad they thought of that here. I mean, if they hadn't have thought, why didn't we think of that before? Fight fires when they're small, when it's effective. See, this is the kind of thing I'm talking about. The leaders can demonstrate concern and action. Agencies are comfortable with suppression. They don't object to these kinds of statements. The media doesn't ask any hard questions like, haven't we thought about this? Haven't we already tried this and it doesn't work? right? And the public perceives control. You know, those officials are in control. They're concerned about the same things we are, so therefore everything's okay. All right. So my final slide, I'm gonna quote from Peter Drucker. He was a business management consultant, and he was talking here about corporate culture and corporate strategies. He says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And what he means is, it doesn't matter how good your strategy is, how well founded it is. The corporate culture can devour that and completely change the effectiveness of any kind of corporate strategy. Well, I propose a corollary to that, and that culture eats science before breakfast. I've been in research now for 30 years, and I can tell you that 30 years prior to me and 30 years prior to that, science was well developed enough to employ fire uses that were sustainable and beneficial to our lands, and we chose to ignore it every time. So the question I have for everyone here is, what eats culture? How do we implement policies and strategies and science-based management actions that actually sustain our values and our landscapes rather than destroy them? So I'm finished, and I will be very happy to address any of your questions if I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I've got lots of comments coming through about the parallels between the US and Australia. I mean, we've got a big focus on suppression here. We have, sorry, just lost my train of thought, and working through with traditional owners and their effect on landscape management. So there's a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll just work through them. Before I do that, I'll just introduce Jackson Parker, who is the Deputy Chair of Predictive Services Group. So this is a joint webinar with the Centre of Excellence, Red Eye, and the Fire Behaviour Analyst Network. So Jackson's here representing that network today. He's joined us for Q&A. So Mark, in Australia, we have what we call tolerable fire intervals, which we use for working out how long it is between before we put fire back in the landscape after a prescribed burn. Do you have something like that in the US for your different vegetation classes?
Yes, we do. All of the fire history information that's been developed by researchers across the country really has gone into these kinds of plans and into planning documents. And these, I showed a very, very tiny bit of that kind of information showing historical fire return intervals in a lot of these ecosystems. And that information is widespread for many different ecosystems in the United States. Now, one of the challenges, of course, is adapting that for modern climate, but also the realities of being able to implement fire on these landscapes. And we struggle with even getting one fire onto the landscape, much less repeat burning. And I'm talking about the West. So if you're down in the southeastern United States, Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, that kind of thing, they do a much better job. They have a culture down there that fire is part of, and they do a much better job of messaging. It's really almost two countries here in the United States, the Southeast and in the Western United States. So yes, we have this information. How do we adapt it to modern conditions? And then how do we actually achieve our goals that are based in this kind of science? Those are questions that we still haven't answered.
And just moving on for that, addressing Kathy's question, do you have vegetation types that should not be burnt on rotation, or have you researched that in depth? Like Australian rainforests here, they tend to exclude fire, but that also can have an impact because in some parts of Queensland, for instance, rainforest is encroaching on some of the woodlands. So how do you balance with that?
So yes, we have similar kinds of situations as your rainforest. The Pacific Northwest on the coast of Washington State and of Oregon, right along the coast on the western slope of the Cascades and the Coast Ranges there. Very wet coastal environment. And it's an interesting conundrum because, as I mentioned, the Native Americans burned in those environments an awful lot, right? And there were also natural fires that occurred on very, very long return intervals. These are stand-destroying kinds of fire regimes, we call them. So when fires occur, it kills everything, and then the forest is renewed after that over very long periods. You're talking about many centuries, 800 years maybe. And so you have a mix of indigenous burning and catastrophic kinds of fire events. And I don't think the management regimen has actually been worked out there. What are we trying to achieve, and how would we go about doing that? Because our native peoples are no longer active on the land, not like they are in Northern Australia.
Yeah, I guess that goes to Kathy's question about teaching the burning for the season, so putting the right fire in at the right time.
Yeah, I would say those are nuances that haven't yet really been accommodated by a lot of our burning practices, because first of all, we're just trying to get fire on the ground. We're just trying to get any fire on the ground. And so the conditions, the prescription conditions, the windows for burning are fairly narrow the way we're looking at it right now. I don't think they're in practice actually as narrow as we try to make them. We try to exert as much control over fire as we can, and we're not very opportunistic about it. And this leaves us with these narrow slices of time and conditions for doing burning. And those are all practical kinds of constraints. The season of burning isn't much of an issue. I'm not saying it isn't, it shouldn't be. It just isn't mainly in the mindset of a lot of the people who are doing burning, because they're just trying to get any fire down on the land at this point.
Yeah. A question from Matt. Does research fit into the wildland fire culture and incentives, and if so, where?
Could you repeat that? I didn't quite get
Sorry.
that question.
Does research fit into the wildland fire culture and incentives, and if so, where does it fit?
Oh, I think so. So from my talk here, you probably gathered, although I didn't say it explicitly, but the social science issues surrounding wildland fire are probably dominating the challenges. I kind of hinted at it in the last series of slides with culture, but research, I think, in the social sciences is extremely important, and we do too little of it. It's the kind of social science I'm talking about, however, is not simply asking people through questionnaires what they think, because it has a lot more to do with how do we understand how to change attitudes towards fire, rather than asking people about what they currently think. It's how do you figure out how to help them understand what they need to understand in order to support the kinds of management activities that we need. And so the research questions are not in the physical sciences or ecological. It's all social science with respect to these questions.
So that goes to Helen's question. What do you think are the key barriers to learning to coexist with fire and protect our natural values? And then how might we overcome them?
Well, if I knew how to change culture, I would be like Peter Drucker, a business management consultant, because there's a lot more money in it there. But that's an excellent question. I don't know how to answer it. I don't know which one of those pieces to push on first. I suspect education, a sustained education, a public information campaign would go a long way towards opening people's minds to a different way of thinking, and that goes for everyone in the public, the elected officials, media, everybody. And a sustained effort. We've seen how effective public information efforts have been with respect to smoking and to seat belts and a lot of other public safety issues. We've just never tried to apply those same things to wildland fire.
Yeah. Question from Glenn. Any advice on how to develop meaningful objectives for fire management? and then to balance the sometimes competing needs of different segments of the community?
A great question. So one of the things we've been working with our national forests on is trying to get them to understand the importance of setting fire objectives in their land management plans. Most of our plans for our national forests do not have fire objectives in them. They don't have anything in there. They may mention, well, we'll protect the forest from fire, meaning suppression, right? But one of the ways that we've encouraged some of the forests at this point to approach this problem is to take a look at the fire rotations on their forest from the historical information, meaning that you know the geographic extent of the various forest types and the attendant fire regimes, and you can come up with a very simple table that shows how many hectares per year need to be burned at what intensity in what vegetation type. And you can sum those up to come up with a forest-wide goal. And you can also put error bounds on it, right? So some years you're not going to burn as much and some years burn more, but basically your goals, your objectives then are ecological. This is the amount of fire that we need to sustain the landscapes in the condition that we have them. And if we had that I think that would go a long way towards having our fire management and land management staffs understand the need for fire out there, whether that fire is prescribed burning or whether that's managed fire, natural fires that start and then are managed. So hopefully that answers the question. That's how the science of the fire ecology comes into establishing management objectives, ecological based management objectives.
And it's probably, as you said, it's no good saying our objective is to keep fire out of the forest. You need some sort of measurable objective in there so that you can track how you're going. So yeah.
Exactly.
There's a lot of questions coming through, but I just want to give an opportunity to Andrew and Jackson while they're online to say something or put a question to you. And if we run out of time, what we'll do is we might put those questions through to you via email and put the responses that you give on the YouTube channel when we post the video on YouTube. So Andrew or Jackson, do you have anything you'd like to ask Mark?
Andrew, if you want to go first.
Cool, thanks, Jackson. Good to see you over there in the west. Early start for you. Well, talking time zones, I should mention the mountain time where Mark is. It's getting pretty late in the evening, so appreciate that, Mark.
All right, my wife knows I'm going to be late.
A couple of things from me. One is the obvious parallel, if you like, between the US issues and the Australian issues. You know, we're facing exactly the same issues. One of the things that jumped off the page for me is greater than 90% of funding goes into suppression. Same issues here in Australia. And somebody else, I think it was Shane, about how do we address misinformation? And like your response to the changing culture, if we knew the answers to those, you know, we'd have the people off the streets in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane rioting against anti-vaccination, you know, anti-vax rioters. So two things out of that is that's our job, you know, we're us all on this webinar, is that this misinformation, you know, we can only address this. We've got to shift this balance away from suppression, fighting fire, shift the language and the thinking of the people who make the decisions, the people who do have the levers and the checkbooks, if you like. That's our responsibility, all of us. It means engaging with, you know, collaborating in the private sector now. You know, there's a place for the private sector to help people, you know, enable their strategies, to operationalise that, to get it down to the tactical level. Because there's lots of strategies. I hear you with the objectives. Objectives, I think the issue with objectives is that people can be held to account to objectives, and there's a reluctance for people to be held to account, especially when we're making predictions about the future and what we might achieve in the future. So I think objectives are an issue. But what we can do is assist with decision support and that quantifying evaluation. One of your quotes I read out at the start, Mark. My last thing I'd say, at least for this part, is that it's the definition of insanity, you know, to do the same things over and over. We can shift that. all of us, if we work together, you know, we're all going to be part of the solution. And great talk. Thanks, Mark. You can see by the interest of all the people, the number of people online and the number of questions that, you know, it's a testament to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. A lot of people are passionate about this, including me. I'm glad to see it on your side there too.
Cheers, over to you, Jackson.
Yeah, thank you. So in Western Australia, so we've just had the announcement of the future close of our native forest industry, which is much reduced than it was previously, but also the source of a lot of firefighters' knowledge, access and water points in our forests and management in general. So, and also we have a very strong land management agency with a good prescribed burning background. However, once you get outside of their managed lands, that culture of burning is not very strong. And I think one of those challenges is that at our kind of local government level, outside our national parks and state forests, is that we need to be doing more burning, but building that culture where it doesn't really exist is very hard and probably generational, a generational challenge, which also sees the value of not losing those skills where we do have them, because they're so hard to reintroduce. Brian Levine's got a really good question about let it burn policies. So when you do have a wildfire, bushfire under milder conditions, enabling them to burn out to natural breaks or existing breaks, and we do a lot of ecological damage by putting in breaks that are unnecessary or duplicating breaks. So people who aren't confident with bushfire will often put a break, you know, within tens of meters of an existing break, rather than let it burn out. So you're kind of building that culture and confidence. My last thing is we have had challenges with ecological burning, where we would do mosaic burning, patch burning, where we have found in some circumstances they haven't provided a kind of hazard reduction outcome. However, we may have assumed that they would, and we find that, you know, at an unfortunate time that they haven't. So there's also that challenge with, you know, when we talk about right fire, that we are meeting both objectives and not just one. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackson and Andrew. Look, I'm really sorry. I think we could spend hours unpacking a lot of the things that Mark talked about today, and I would love to have that opportunity in the future again. But we are out of time. As I said, I will send the questions to Mark if he's okay with that, and if he could answer them in a text format, we'll post them on the YouTube video when I post that online. So I'd just like to also let you know that we are having a third webinar in this series. The Charles Darwin University have been doing some research on how to value ecological assets and have been trialling it with communities across Northern Australia. So we just haven't quite pinned down the date for that yet, but keep an eye on that. It'll be in late October. So yeah, it will require a separate registration to these two webinars as well. Don't forget our next webinar is on the 12th of October. I've forgotten the time off the top of my head because it's around across different time zones across Australia. And so I'd like to again thank Andrew for linking us up with Mark today, and thank Mark again very much for his time. It is late in Missoula, and thank you to Jackson also for joining in and participating. And we'll see you all at our next webinar on the 12th. Thanks very much, everybody.